All right, so this is a practice talk for the 15-minute talk that I have the honor of giving for the Fahrenheit 2451 uh, conference this weekend, which is being hosted by the Internet Archive. Super cool place, super cool initiative. Really grateful for it and grateful to be visiting. If you're ever in San Francisco, you should totally check it out. I think they have tours on Fridays. And the theme of this conference is ideas worth saving. And so, in a kind of like imaginative exercise, I am suggesting here with this talk that the principal theme of Owen Barfield's work, especially embodied in his book, Saving the Appearances, The Evolution of Consciousness, is an idea crucial, it would be crucial to save in a potential future where the media sphere is so full of illusion and deception that we lose access to a kind of coherent narrative of the past. And it's important to recognize that history is always provisional. We're always correcting what we thought we knew, and it's always, we're finite creatures, so we're always narrating the past from particular historically contextualized perspective. So history is always provisional and contested. So just, that's just true in general. And what's potentially valuable about Barfield's work in that respect as well, if he's onto something, which I think he is that there may be a kind of shape to history, a kind of ideal, um, I don't know if ideal is the right word necessarily, but a shape that we might attune ourselves to and so participate in its sort of teleological unfolding if perhaps there is some kind of telos to history. And so that's what I'm going to be suggesting in this short talk, 15-minute talk, so it's going to go fast. It will be by no means an exhaustive presentation of Barfield's ideas, but it'll be a little taster. So, this talk is called, let me share my screen. Owen Barfield and the Future of History, which just so happens to be the subtitle of my dissertation. And so, as Barfield writes in Saving the History in English Words, language has preserved for us the inner living history of man's soul, humanity's soul. It reveals the evolution of consciousness. So, for those who aren't familiar with Barfield, I won't be getting into it so much, but his way into the evolution of consciousness was through the study of etymology, through the study of the transformation of word meanings over time and what's kind of implied about the experience correlative of those word meanings. So, before we get into saving the appearances, it's really important, even though, of course, like as you read it, he'll unpack this concept for you, but to get a sense for what this word participation, this concept participation meant for Barfield. And as I understand it, as a philosophical concept, it originated with Plato in the Greek word methexis, which, again, as I understand it, conveyed something like the group sharing of the audience in the theatrical performance. And so, what Barfield and Plato are both using it in the context of participation in the relationship between what we perceive with our senses and divine ideas that manifest through the temporary play of appearances that is what we perceive through our senses. So there's that particular tree that I see there, but there's also the idea of the tree. And if I really want to know what the tree is, I need to sort of penetrate to the divine idea of treeness. And so then I can recognize trees when they continually show up in particular instantiations. So, but Barfield says participation at the beginning of Saving the Appearances is an awareness which we no longer have of an extrasensory link between the percipient and the representations. So, for many of us, I would say most of us today, we are conditioned according to a kind of materialistic way of thinking. And so we tend to just our common sense is we experience objects as out there and we perceive them through our senses, but they're like out there and we don't really have much uh, it's more our senses that are delivering this to us than our ideas. But if you look on either side of the screen, we have one of these images that doubles. So like you can either see a donkey or a seal. And you have to sort of, if you couldn't see one of those before, now that you have the concept, maybe you can. But and what that shows to you is your participation in the image. It's not just the sense data that you're getting, it's also the concept seal or donkey, something that your mind is bringing forth uh, in what you perceive as a thing, as the donkey or the seal. And so, what this brings to light is we're bringing into our awareness our participation in what we perceive. And so, this is always going on all the time. Our memories are unconsciously informing what we perceive so that we, again, recognize a tree because we've seen trees before. There's a lot more going on than that, of course, because we are cultural beings, historical beings, historically situated. So, just to give you a sense for what participation is signifying. And also a little bit of background. So Barfield was very deeply informed by the work of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who is most famous for his Faust, so most famous as a poet, but he felt that his amateur, and I mean amateur as for the love of doing scientific work would be more important for posterity. So I'll say a bit about that in a second, but also just to say that Rudolf Steiner, who came later, and who Barfield was a follower of, his spiritual movement called anthroposophy. Steiner was a philosopher and a spiritual teacher, and before he got into kind of being a public esotericist, he edited Goethe's scientific works and felt that Goethe's approach to science, which in some sense is a kind of continuation of the pre-modern Neoplatonic, almost shamanic way of seeking to know the world, as his quote down here conveys, the delicate empiricism which makes itself utterly identical with the object. So like, if you want to know something, you have to sort of attend to it to the extent that you almost become one with it, and that is how you know, inwardly one with it, and that is how you truly know something. And Steiner sought to expand Goethe's method to the whole of life, and like cosmic evolution. Um, and so Goethe was alive at the same time as Newton and had a kind of polemic with Newton and was just concerned about the overall way of relating or presenting knowledge. And so it wasn't that the more abstract experimental science was something that Goethe thought was a bad thing. He just thought that nature is living and that we're a part of nature. And if we really want to know nature, for example, if you want to know what light and color are all really about, you have to do a bunch of different experiments and combine them all together so that you see things from as many different perspectives as possible and can kind of unite with the archetypal dynamics of light and color. And the same with plant morphology, botany, which was one of Goethe's major fields of study. And because plants are a kind of temporal phenomenon, they can kind of give us a sense for what's going on maybe in this approach being brought to history, which is what I think Barfield does. So by attending to so many different kinds of plants, Goethe felt like he gradually got to know like the archetypal dynamics of plantness. Like what is the archetypal plant and how what is constant in the diversity of its manifestations in these different species. And once he had attended to so many different variations, he felt like he knew the archetypal plant such that he could potentially imagine new species unfolding in his own imagination. And the more that you do this, the more you practice something like this, the more that you can have like a few examples, for example, of like leaves of one plant and potentially imagine the further unfolding of that. And so it suggests that there's this kind of invisible shape to the unfolding temporal shape of time that belongs to this being. And so perhaps there's something also going on with history itself, with the evolution of the world and of human consciousness. So I think that's what's going on in Barfield's trying to get us to participate the phenomena of history in saving the appearances. And he says at the beginning of saving the appearances, which I want to frame as a kind of spiritual exercise, that his main goal is to induce in the reader a sustained acceptance in the reader of the relation assumed by physical science to subsist between human consciousness on the one hand, uh, and on the other, the familiar world of which that consciousness is aware. So what he's saying is that, we've known for a while, the physicists have told us for a while that what we perceive with our senses is not the world that they study with their instruments, and that we participate in bringing forth this world, this qualitative world of phenomena. But he says that we've not been inconsistent in other disciplines with this insight. We accept it, but for example, when we go to study the history of the earth and the history of humanity, we forget that this phenomenal world is one that we participate in bringing forth not only through our senses, but also with our minds and our imagination. And so we tend to imagine the prehistory of the earth according to the way that we perceive the earth now. But he says, if we're consistent and we look back in human history, and what we find is the report of uh, imaginaries, like the worldview and and what's implied, the kind of experience that is implied by ancient languages. We would have to say that actually the phenomenal world of the past was a different world. It was a world that was pervaded by spirits and gods and ancestors. And so he wants us to be consistent with what the physicists say when we go to look at other into other disciplines, and in particular the discipline of history, the history of humanity, the history of consciousness, and the history of the earth itself. We can't really say if we juxtapose what the world was like for ancient Greeks, for example, with the world as we experience it now, it wouldn't be correct to just project backwards what we experience now and say that's how the earth was, because apparently that's not how the earth has always been. And so Barfield says when you are consistent uh, with what the physicists say when we look back at history, you have to posit something like what he calls original participation. And when the way he describes this is as the essence is that there stands behind the phenomena, and on the other side of them from me, a represented which is of the same nature as the perceiving self, inasmuch as it is not mechanical or accidental, but psychic and voluntary. So what he's saying is that what's disclosed by mythology, the various media that we have from the past, but particularly language, is that the world for the ancients seems to have been one that was ensouled or peopled with various agencies. And so also that meaning was immediately given in experience rather than something that was thought about. The world was a speaking world, and that this primordial experience of the world as a kind of subject, not just a collection of objects, is what language precipitated out of eventually through memory, through the internalization of what we have perceived outwardly, the symbols that we have perceived outwardly, and then we begin to use those symbols that we've internalized in the form of memory, and language is born, and we begin to kind of through language make distinctions between things, and gradually this distinction between the things of the world and us comes about and facilitates this awakening of self-consciousness. So, and one of the major testimonies to this experience of the world for Barfield is what he calls compact or perceptual or imaginal word meanings. Uh, Real quickly, one example is the Greek word pneuma, which we would today translate either we're going to talking about wind or spirit, or sorry, wind or breath or spirit. Whereas for them, it meant all three of those meanings at once, which suggests that wind was more than just wind for them, and the same with breath. So here we have the overall shape, which you could describe as a kind of beginning, with the far reaches of original participation in an undifferentiated unity where humanity was bound up with the life of nature. And the mythologies, we could say, are a kind of testament to that. through this to this gradual polarization of subject and object, and the other distinctions that attend that, which in modernity have come to be described in a more kind of binary way. So humanity versus nature, society versus nature, history versus evolution. We have human history, which deals with rational, free agents, and natural evolution, and we're not sure how to like reconcile these things. And so Barfield thinks, there has been in this evolution of consciousness or metamorphosis of consciousness, this fall from this primordial participation in the world that was like giving forth meaning into this kind of hellish idolatry where we no longer participate in the phenomena that we bring forth, um, and now we experience it rather than something that's being given, the meaning being given without, we experience it as if it's just our own organism uh producing the representations, which it is in a sense. We have a kind of new sort of um capacity to attend to things as either objects or representations through this whole process. But as Barfield thinks Rudolf Steiner and Goethe represent, there's another possibility, which is to willfully, yes, not dispense with our sort of technological achievement that is expressed in approaching the world as object, but also to renew once again this kind of throughout our own will, um, a attending to the world as revelation, as a kind of the stars and the planets and the creatures as a kind of theophany that we are participating in the unfolding of. And so that even our own individual lives have a kind of symbolic character to them. And so in becoming aware of a shape like this to history, and Barfield calls this potential renewal of participation that doesn't um, annul the distinction that has come about with self-consciousness, but uh, through the self's willful renewal of participation maintains that, but then renews a kind of relationship with the spiritual world that shines through phenomena. That if we can attune to this shape of history, uh, even if the past becomes obscured to us through a loss of information, if we can align ourselves with this process, and so like Goethe, you know, in his aspiration to unite with the being of the plant, we might unite with the being of the unfolding of the cosmos and be put in toe with its teleological unfolding and maybe even some kind of intuitive perception of its cosmic past. Thank you, and uh, not exhaustive, but a little taste.